All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. We got a lot of news to get to today. Donald Trump has called the latest offer from the Iranians totally unacceptable, and he rejected it just yesterday. So we'll talk about the implications from that latest news. Also, the Washington Post reported a couple days ago that Iran still has the missile stockpile to survive for months amid the ongoing U.S. blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vastly different analysis than the one that we've been receiving from the U.S. government for the past couple weeks. So we'll be discussing that as well today. And then later on in the episode, we're going to be reacting to Benjamin Netanyahu's interview on 60 Minutes from this weekend, which left us with some interesting clips to analyze. So all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.
Maybe we should improve the liberty of our own country before we seek to do so abroad. Some of us have paid attention to the fact that the expert class, including the foreign policy experts, lie all the time. The correct answer to this, of course, as it always is liberty. All right, everybody, before we begin, if you could please go down below this video here on YouTube and hit like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, Spotify, and Substack and giving all of those a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. And just before we begin here, I have a couple of quick announcements I wanted to share with you all. I was actually, in the last week, featured on antiwar.com 2 separate times, which is very exciting. I submitted a couple articles to the website, and they were nice enough to feature me once in the viewpoints section, and which is kind of like an opinion section, and then once in the blog. So that was very cool. I just wanted to let you guys know the first article I submitted was on May 5th. It was published, Imperial Lies and the War in Iran. This was featured in the viewpoints section of the website. It was on the front page of antiwar.com for a day, which is very cool. The subtitle is, Under the Guise of Principled Conservatism, the United States has been led down a path of global empire and endless wars. So go and read this if you have not already. There's been a lot of comments and stuff. It seems to be getting some good engagement, which is very cool. So if you haven't read it already, go read that on antiwar.com. You can find it in the archives of their viewpoints there. And the second one, which was just released this weekend on their blog, was Israel's nuclear secrecy is finally being questioned. And I would highly recommend, actually, that everyone go read that if you get some free time. And the subtitle is, Israel has operated a secret nuclear weapons program for decades. Finally, people are starting to ask questions about it. And it just goes into a lot of the detail amid some news that some House Democrats are requesting that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, change the U.S. policy towards Israel's secret nukes and actually acknowledge their existence. So in this article on the blog, I go into some detail about the history of Israel's secret nuclear program, some of the key controversies surrounding it that have occurred over the past couple decades, and why it is strategically important for the United States in the mind of the people who rule the regime to maintain the secrecy around this nuclear program, because it obviously creates quite the double standard when you acknowledge that Israel is dragging us into a war with Iran over nukes that don't exist, while they also simultaneously have a secret nuclear program that is not inspected by any international inspections regimes, which is not officially recognized by the United States to exist. So it creates a lot of obvious hypocrisy, and I highly recommend everyone go read this, because I think it was pretty good. I feel like I put a lot of work into that, and I'm proud of it. So if everyone could go read that, I'd really appreciate that. And it is just very cool to be on antiwar.com. You know, if we watch this show, that I cite them a lot for some of my news. I'm going to again today. They're just a great resource for a non-interventionist viewpoint of foreign policy, and they're just on top of all the latest news. So I'd highly recommend antiwar.com. Go read the 2 articles from the past week that I have up there. And yeah, I really appreciate that. Let's get into the news, though. This is the news of the day. We're going to actually start off by reading antiwar.com to discuss what I said in the intro here. that Donald Trump has rejected the latest proposal from the Iranians. The Iranians sent over another plan, which included a lot of demands that the Trump administration was not willing to budge on. So Trump rejected it and lashed out on Truth Social, calling it totally unacceptable. Here is the piece from Dave DeCamp on antiwar.com about this from yesterday. It says, quote, President Trump said on Sunday that Iran's response to the latest U.S. proposal to reach a deal was, quote, totally unacceptable, signaling that the two sides are still not close to reaching a deal. Quote, I have just read the response from Iran's so-called representatives. I don't like it. Totally unacceptable. Thank you for your attention to this matter, the president wrote on Truth Social. Trump has made similar comments to Axios reporter Barack Ravid, saying, quote, I don't like their letter. It's inappropriate. I don't like their response. They have been tapping along many nations for 47 years. The president said that he spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday about Iran's response. According to Israeli media, Israeli officials are trying to convince the U.S. counterparts to launch major attacks aimed at destroying Iran's energy infrastructure. An Iranian source told Iran's Tasnim news agency that Trump's rejection of Tehran's response was, quote, of no importance because no one, quote, writes proposals to please Trump. The source added that the, quote, negotiating team should draft proposals only for the rights of the Iranian people, and when Trump is dissatisfied with them, naturally that is better. So it seems as if there's been no progress made, and this has been the common theme for a couple episodes now, if you've been keeping up with the episodes here and the news of these negotiations in general. This is where it seems to be. There is a complete standstill in terms of negotiations. We're told about this success, the supposed success of this negotiation process, this diplomatic process that's playing out in the background between the United States and Iran and these Gulf states that are trying to act as the mediators and Pakistan. And in reality, if you've been keeping up with the actual news and read past the headlines of these Trump Truth Social posts, there's been literally no progress made, and that's been true for a couple weeks now. Both sides are firmly sticking to their red lines. The United States' demands include that Iran cannot have any nuclear enrichment whatsoever. They have to basically disassemble their entire civilian nuclear program. They can't be allowed to enrich uranium whatsoever, 0%. And, of course, they also can't acquire a nuclear weapon. So, basically, the United States has adopted Israel's maximalist demand, which wasn't ours until about a month ago. It was literally just about a month ago that the United States officially adopted the Israeli position of no enrichment at all, not even a civilian program, which is what they already have. They don't have a weapons program. That's just not true. They haven't had one since 2003. So that is the U.S. demand that is really causing a sticking point here because, again, the whole point of this war, number one, the goal was regime change, which hasn't happened, and they acknowledged that a couple days in that it wasn't possible. So they shifted. It wasn't possible barring some massive escalation like ground forces. That would be too much for the civilian populations of the United States to bear. That would be unacceptable to the civilians here in the United States. So barring some massive Iraq-style invasion, regime change is basically off the table, and it was a couple days into this war. So the United States shifted their position to no enriched uranium because that was one of the other objectives of the war was to put limits. At first, it was to put limits on their ability to enrich uranium so that they could never acquire a nuclear weapon. And then later on, it shifted literally about a month ago. After the ceasefire went into effect, as the negotiations began, the U.S. demand and our position in this shifted to the Israeli position of no enrichment at all, not even a civilian program, which is what they already have. So that's what the United States is demanding at this point. What the Iranians are demanding is that not only do they want to keep their nuclear program, their civilian nuclear program, because they view it as basically the same thing as their sovereignty. This is what they say. And sovereignty is the ability for a country to control what happens within its borders. So they basically view it just as much of an important factor to them as literally controlling what happens in their country. So that, they say, is off the table for negotiations, at least until a later date, to even discuss that. So that is what the Iranians are saying about their nuclear. Now, they are also making demands as to what happens to the Strait of Hormuz, because over the course of this war, you would know, if you've been paying attention to the process of this war, that Iran has now gained control of the Strait of Hormuz, which they did not have before. It was a free waterway before. And now Iran has moved in and taken control of the Strait of Hormuz, and they are closing it at this point. Iran wants that to become the new status quo. They want to maintain control of it, and the deal would be that they would just open it. They wouldn't relinquish control of the strait. They could maintain the right to close it whenever they feel like it, but they want to be allowed to hold it and just allow it to open in exchange for tolls, which they are floating the idea of splitting between Iran and Oman. That is the idea Iran is floating, and that's the demand they are making. They are saying that now that they have gained control of the Strait of Hormuz, this is now their deterrence. They want this to be a deterrent from future attacks from the United States and from Israel as we go on here. And this, like the nuclear deterrent, is going to be a new way that Iran wants to use leverage in the region to prevent a regime change from the U.S. and Israel. So that's what Iran is thinking, and that's what they're demanding. Now, they are also demanding a couple other things, and that was what Trump rejected in this deal. It was reported just I think this morning, that the specifics of what Trump rejected included things like war reparations to Iran. They're demanding money in these deals that they're drafting up. They're also looking for things like the unfreezing of assets that are frozen right now. They're looking for a relief of all sanctions. They're looking for a lot of demands from the United States. They are making a lot of demands. And this is just obviously not acceptable to the United States, which is trying to find a way out. That seems to have been the situation for the past couple of weeks, is that Trump understands, it seems that he understands that this is a disaster. I mean, it would be hard to believe that he doesn't understand that at this point because of how obvious it is. But Trump is looking for a way out that allows him to try and declare victory, even though it's obvious to everyone else that this was an utter embarrassment for the United States. He wants a way out of this as soon as possible so we can move on to the midterms, move on to other things that are significantly more important, and so that he can try and regain some popularity from this by declaring victory, because he reads the polls, he lies about it. He lies and says the polls are going up. He reads the polls and knows that they are the lowest of his presidency, first term or second term, because of this war. I believe it was 62 or 66, something like that, in that range, percent of Americans in the latest YouGov poll from yesterday said that America has lost the war. So the majority of the country both say it was a mistake to launch the war and that we lost the war. So the country is very one-sided on this. The people of this country understand this was a stupid war, a pointless war, fought for a foreign country that has gotten us nothing. We all understand this, and in response to that, Trump's approval rating are the lowest they've ever been. So Trump knows this. Trump can feel that this trend in the country that's going against him, and he wants to try and get out of this war in a way that saves face, because it can't, if, say we agreed, the United States agreed to all those demands I just listed from the Iranians, war reparations, like, are you kidding? Unfreezing of all the assets, relieving all the sanctions, giving Iran the Strait of Hormuz, and then we don't even talk about nuclear. So Iran maintains their nuclear program, and all those demands I just listed out are given to them. In what way could Trump possibly spin that into a win? How is he going to? This is why he can't. That's why he can't accept this. Like, this is, he's trying to get out of this, and I hope he finds a way out of this, because this is ridiculous. But from a strategic standpoint, if you're thinking of this from Trump's perspective, in what world could Trump possibly accept that? You can't even pretend that's a win at that point. And we'll get into it here in a second, I will get in, this will be a little bit later. The Washington Post just reported that Iran and their missile stockpile has not been significantly depleted from this war. They actually have quite a large supply of missiles still in their arsenal that they could use to survive for months amid the U.S. blockade. And if the war started up again, if the real fighting started up again, they'd actually be in a pretty good spot to continue at the pace they were before, launching missiles at all the Gulf states, launching missiles at Israel, launching missiles at U.S. bases, the ones that are left that haven't been completely destroyed and abandoned by the U.S. military. That is what the state of the war is for the Iranians. And meanwhile, the United States, again, as I said, a large amount of our bases in the region have been literally destroyed and abandoned by the Iranians. Like, they destroyed them, and the United States military literally left the bases, and they've just left them behind. There's no word that they'll even be trying to repair them or going back to them at any point. So that's where we are in the region. So with all this being considered, in what world is this a win for Donald Trump? In what way can he spin this into a win? But that's the problem, because he needs to find a way out of this that allows him to spin it, which is what he needs. He's inevitably going to try to do it, and he's looking for a way to do it in the most convincing way possible. So that's what's stalling us from actually being able to end this war. It's Trump's ego and his unwillingness to admit that he lost, which is just true. And somebody with a little bit more humility would be able to admit that they lost this war and say that it was a mistake to bring the country to this war. And, maybe actually that would even help him in the poll numbers. Maybe that would actually be best for him if he could just go on camera in a address to the nation and say, you know what, this war was a mistake. The Israelis sold me that it would be easy and quick. The regime would fall in days, and it just wasn't like that. And now we're just going to back out, and we're going to move on to trying to improve the lives of the American people. If any president ever would just go on TV and say that, I bet they would actually get some good reception to that, because you're being honest for once. Enough of these fake press conferences with Pete Hegseth, where everyone who's watching it in the room and on TV knows Pete Hegseth is not telling the truth at all. Everyone knows he's completely lying on behalf of the administration. Nothing Pete Hegseth says even has an ounce of truth to it in these press conferences. Yet we keep engaging in this ritual where we need to all the media need to rush into the press room, listen to Pete Hegseth as if what he's saying is true, when we all know it's not. So this is the game we're in right now. We're trying to spin this into a way that makes it comfortable enough for Trump to leave with some semblance of dignity. But they seem completely unable to do that. And the Iranians are unwilling to let them do that. Because, again, the strategy for the Iranians is to create the amount of deterrence necessary to make it so that the United States and Israel think twice before ever trying this again. That is what the Iranians are engaged in now, and they're doing it quite successfully. Sorry, I know people don't want to hear that, but look at how much of a pain this war has been. We went into it saying 3 to 4 days would be the length of this war. We're in the middle of month 3 at this point. Nothing has been achieved, and now we are stuck in this escalation trap where we can't leave the war. So, yes, deterrence has been created. The Iranians have taken the Strait of Hormuz and closed it and put a massive stranglehold on the global economy. And meanwhile, they have the missiles to last for months, if need be. So, this is the state of the war, and this is why it's been such a hassle for the Trump administration. And it probably has given them second thoughts. I'm sure it has. I'm sure they're all saying this was a terrible idea. But they can't publicly say that because that would be admitting defeat. And they can't do that. Now, just real quick here before we move on to that Washington Post article, which is very interesting. I do just want to talk about this Project Freedom thing that was floated a couple days ago that just got immediately scrapped. And the story behind that was completely lied about by the administration. And it only took a couple hours for Dropsite News originally to come out and break the truth about that story. Now, Project Freedom was put out on Trump's Truth Social post. It was announced that it would be the U.S. military escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz, basically in an effort to just pry the strait open with U.S. military force, and then that would likely lead to a way for the United States to just leave the conflict, because now the main point of contention, the Strait of Hormuz, has now been opened by the U.S. military. That was the idea of Project Freedom from the Trump administration. Within I think it was about 4 or 5 hours, that idea got instantly scrapped, and they said it was because the Iranians were negotiating, and we want to let the negotiations play out. That's just totally not true. The truth was, and this was reported just hours later by Dropsite News, that the reason they scrapped Project Freedom was because Saudi Arabia and Kuwait would not let the United States use the airspace over their countries to engage in Project Freedom. So now, and this is the mixed signals from the Gulf allies that we're listening to, they simultaneously some of them want the war to continue, and some of them want diplomacy to continue. And now, as I said before, we're stuck in this incredibly tangled web where any idea now that we've entirely outsourced our foreign policy to Israel, these Gulf allies and the kings of these countries and the emirs of these countries, and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who have business dealings with all the rich people in all the Gulf states, now that we've outsourced our foreign policy to all these conflicts of interest, we're stuck in this tangled web where we can't even make a move to try and leave this war or solve a problem. And by the way, I'm not saying I would support Project Freedom, just to be clear, but I'm saying we can't even make a move in our foreign policy without first considering every single conflict of interest with all these Gulf states. So we have Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who have business dealings with every emir and every business leader in all these Gulf states, and they're the ones negotiating with them about America's foreign policy. And then you have the Israelis chiming in, and Netanyahu, who is friends with Jared Kushner, who is doing the negotiating on behalf of Netanyahu, essentially, with the Iranians. So you have this entire web of conflicts of interest, and nowhere in this equation is the interest of the United States even considered. But that is the latest with the war on the ground. We're going to move on now to the Washington Post article, the exclusive piece from the Washington Post from a couple days ago that discusses U.S. intelligence assessments that say Iran can actually outlast Trump's Strait of Hormuz blockade for months. So we'll get into this here. It says, quote, a confidential CIA analysis delivered to administration policymakers this week concludes that Iran can survive a U.S. naval blockade for at least 3 to 4 months before facing more severe economic hardship, 4 people familiar with the document said, a finding that appears to raise new questions about President Donald Trump's optimism on ending the war. The analysis by the U.S. intelligence community, whose secret assessments on Iran have been more sober than that of the Trump administration's public statements, have found that Tehran retains a significant ballistic missile capability despite weeks of intense U.S. and Israeli bombardment, 3 of the people familiar with it said. Iran retains about 75% of its pre-war inventory of mobile launchers and about 70% of its pre-war stockpile of missiles, a U.S. official said. The official said there's evidence that the regime has been able to recover and reopen almost all of its underground storage facilities, repair some damaged missiles, and even assemble some new missiles that were nearly complete when the war began. Trump painted a rosier picture in the Oval Office remarks on Wednesday, saying of Iran, quote, their missiles are mostly decimated. They have probably 19%, but not a lot by comparison to what they had. 3 current and 1 former U.S. official confirmed the outlines of the intelligence analysis, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive matter. So, Trump, what we can chop this up to is Trump just completely lied in the Oval Office, as has been, as I said before, the theme from Trump, Pete Hegseth, everyone discussing the war from any of these administrative positions. They're all just totally lying to try and save face because this war has been a disaster. This U.S. intelligence assessment that was given to the Washington Post says that, contrary to the insane statements from the Trump administration about how decimated Iran's missile capabilities are, no, Iran still has 75% of their launchers and 70% of their missiles. After all this. Meanwhile, let's look at the U.S. stockpile in the region by comparison. We were 3 days into this war, and what were we talked about it on the show. Go back and look at the episodes I did in the beginning of this war. What were the main stories that were floating around the media surrounding the U.S. and this war and there are stockpiles in the region? We were having to move stockpiles from Japan and South Korea of these Patriot missile defense systems and these THAAD batteries to the region because we were running low on them. 3 or 4 days into the war, this was an instant concern. They were getting destroyed by Iranian drones and missiles. They were running short of supplies. Israel and Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain were all saying they were very short on Patriot missile defense systems. So, meanwhile, as the U.S. stockpile from days into this war has been very scarce, you have the Iranians still, after all this, with 70% of their missile stockpile intact, ready to go for another round of fighting if necessary. This is when you need to realize you cannot trust what the administration is saying, because they have been totally lying to the American people about this entire war, selling it as a success, saying we've achieved all this great stuff, yet there is no substance to anything they say. When Trump says we've achieved all this great stuff in this war, and then rattles off the 2 things that he says every single time, their Air Force and their Navy have been totally depleted, think to yourself, was that ever the objective that was stated at the beginning of the war? Did we launch this war with the stated objective of destroying Iran's Air Force and Navy, which can't threaten the United States in any meaningful way? No, the objectives of the war were ideally regime change, then just if not, it was to eliminate their ability to enrich uranium and have a nuclear program, to destroy their missiles stockpile and drone stockpile, to cut off their ties to the proxies. Like, these were the objectives. And as I've said repeatedly, and I will continue to say, because I need to counter signal the lies that they're telling, that is not true. That we have not achieved any of these objectives. Any of the objectives that we stated at the beginning of this war, we and the Israelis, none of them have been achieved at all. And that is just true. That's objectively true. There is not one source you could point to prove me wrong on that. We have not gotten regime change. As much as they actually tried to sell that for a couple days, you might recall, Pete Hegseth said there has been regime change. Meanwhile, as a Khamenei is still sitting in the throne, that's ridiculous. There has not been regime change. The missile and drone stockpiles are actually fine. As it says here, they have 70% still of their drones after Trump floated 18, 19%, just completely out of his ass. Just not true. Their ties to Hezbollah and the Houthis have not been broken at all. It's just not happened. So nothing they are saying is true, and every single objective that we stated at the beginning of this war has not been achieved. And they keep floating out these two lines: the Air Force and the Navy have been decimated. And nobody even thinks to themselves, wait, how is that like a thing that helps me in any way? Did the Air Force and Navy of Iran across the world threaten the United States? Of course it didn't. That's ridiculous. That may have helped Israel, perhaps, but I thought this war wasn't for Israel. This is where the narrative just completely crumbles. They're grasping for straws, claiming that the Navy and the Iran's puny Navy and puny Air Force have been destroyed as some massive win for the region and for the world and for the United States specifically. It's just ridiculous. It's not true. None of our objectives have been achieved, and that is just a fact. This war has been a complete failure, and nobody even wants to listen to that. Nobody wants to hear the truth that this has been a failure, because that would mean this administration led us to a war that ended up being a failure. But the sooner we confront that fact, the sooner we can move on to how do we get out of this. But we're still stuck in the loop where nobody wants to listen to anything that's true, and they just want to stay in their echo chamber of Fox News and pretend this war is a great success. Have you seen the monologues from Jesse Waters over the course of this war, by the way? Jesse Waters, the professional propagandist on Fox News, who basically works on behalf of the state, like is basically a government agent, Jesse Waters, basically, in essence, in what he does. Not officially, but in what he does for work, basically lies on behalf of the government. Jesse Waters, his monologues over the course of this war have been the most disgusting propaganda since COVID. Jesse Waters, a couple weeks ago, when Trump was saying this ridiculous line that we can't even know who to negotiate with, the Iranians aren't, there's chaos in the Iranian government. They have no idea who's negotiating on behalf of them. When Trump was saying that, Jesse Waters picked up the baton from Trump and then went a step further and said there's been an internal coup in the Iranian government. He said that one of the wings of the government has taken over from Khamenei the leadership role of negotiations. There's been an internal coup based on no evidence. Jesse Waters didn't provide any intelligence assessment to prove that point. He just completely made it up for his boomer audience and said there's been a coup in the Iranian government. Jesse Waters basically went on TV in his primetime monologue, and if you were just tuning in without any context, you would have thought there was a regime change in Iran that night. It was crazy. It was like literally watching something out of a dystopian movie of like state propaganda lying to you as transparently as ever. Literally since COVID has there not been something so disgusting on cable news. It's insane. He's repeatedly, Jesse Waters, all the propagandists at Fox News, repeatedly not even questioning anything Trump says on his Truth Social. They take it as gospel, even if it contradicts itself from sentence to sentence, which it does. Trump in the Oval Office will say something back to back that contradicts itself, and they will take that as true because they either don't have any critical thinking skills, which would be surprising considering how far they've made it in media, or they're lying knowingly to you, which is probably more true. They are knowingly lying to you, and you need to disregard every word they say, because why would you watch somebody that knowingly lies to you? So, it's totally ridiculous. We're going to end off here by watching, speaking of people knowingly lying to you, we're going to watch Benjamin Netanyahu's latest appearance on 60 Minutes. He left a couple of interesting clips we're going to look at. The first one here is his clip where he's asked, is the war in Iran over? Because, as we all know, it is up to Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to determine if this war is over, because, whatever he does, we will just go along with completely. Here is Benjamin Netanyahu saying, no, the war is not over because, as I just said, we've achieved nothing. Take a look.
Is the war with Iran over? And if it isn't, who will decide when it is?
I think it accomplished a great deal, but it's not over because there's still nuclear material, enriched uranium that has to be taken out of Iran. There's still enrichment sites that have to be dismantled. There's still proxies that Iran supports. There are ballistic missiles that they still want to produce. Now, we've degraded a lot of it, but all of that is still there, and there's work to be done.
How do you envision the highly enriched uranium will be removed from Iran?
You go in and you take it out.
With what? Special forces from Israel, special forces from the United States?
Well, I'm not going to talk about military means, but what President Trump has said to me, I want to go in there. And I think it can be done physically. That's not the problem. If you have an agreement and you go in and you take it out, why not? That's the best way.
What if there isn't an agreement? Can it be taken out by force?
Well, you're going to ask me these questions. I'm going to dodge them because I'm not going to talk about our military possibilities, plans, or anything of the kind.
And I'm just trying to get at how long is it going to take to achieve that aim?
I'm not going to give a timetable to it, but I'm going to say that's a terrifically important mission.
Now, obviously, from the opposite angle there, Netanyahu is saying basically what I just said, which is nothing that we went into this war claiming to want to achieve has been achieved. And specifically there, he's focusing on the nuclear issue. And this has been floated, this idea of actually going in to Iran in some sort of massive ground operation or some strategic special force operation and trying to acquire the enriched uranium. Now, if you've been reading up on what this would require, then this is fantasy land in terms of what we would be actually asking the forces to do here. This would require dropping in to Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, all these nuclear facilities, digging out from under rubble the enriched uranium, getting specialists in there to contain it properly so it's not leaking everywhere, loading it onto a cargo plane, building a runway, literally from building a runway for this plane to land and take off from, rolling everything into this. This would be a long, drawn-out process, which would require scientists and specialists, and all. This would require a lot of work. And they are saying we're just going to drop special forces in there and just take care of it, without any explanation on how this would possibly be done. Now, this also, all of this would happen amidst firing of drones and missiles from the Iranians. I'm sure authorities would arrive. This would be a massive operation with incredible risk, would probably result in a number of casualties. So this is what we are just casually floating here on 60 Minutes without any idea of what it would actually take. And this is what Netanyahu is pushing for, number one. He doesn't really say it clearly here. He is trying to kind of stay secretive about what he's trying to push here. But Netanyahu in the background has been pushing this. His propagandists in the United States, like Mark Levin, have been pushing this on Fox News. And this is what we are actually talking. He put Mark Levin on his show a couple weekends ago, literally made the case for why it is necessary for the United States to go into Iran and acquire the enriched uranium. And that clip off of his show was reposted on Truth Social by Donald Trump. So Trump is thinking in the background, is this something I want to engage in? Do I want to launch special forces into Iran to dig through the rubble of all their nuclear facilities, which we bombed in June, and acquire the enriched uranium from the rubble? This would be a crazy operation, which is totally reckless and ridiculous. But this is what we're genuinely floating here, because that would be what's best for Israel. This has nothing to do with the United States. If you don't understand by now that this has nothing to do with what's in the United States' best interest and everything to do with what's in Israel's best interests, then you would just have lost the plot, and this is not the conversation for you. But that is clearly what is being on display here. Clearly, we are considering nothing about what's in the United States' best interests, because what would be in our best interest is to leave this war. It would have been in our best interest to never launch it to begin with, but now that we're here, we can choose between escalating, which would be a nightmare, or de-escalating, which would mean accepting a loss, but it's better than escalating. So it would be in our best interest to de-escalate and either admit we lost or trying to play it off like a win. Either way, de-escalation would be the best option for the United States. Israel wants to escalate because Israel cannot allow the Iranian regime to have established this much deterrence, to have survived, and to be emboldened in the region with the Strait of Hormuz, which gives them another ace up their sleeve to deter another future attack from America and Israel. Plus, Israel can see the writing on the wall here in the U.S. and that there's not going to be there might not be another pro-Israel president ever in the United States because of how drastically the trend downward in terms of Israel's favorability has been since October 7th. So Netanyahu is basically an all-out blitz to try and get all of his goals in the region achieved under Trump, who he knows will do his bidding. So this is the dynamic at play here. That is what's in Israel's interest. What's in Israel's interest and Netanyahu's personal interest is to see the regime overthrown, to finish the job. But what's in Trump's best interest and America's best interest is to de-escalate and end the war. That's what we're sitting here. And we all know what's more likely, don't we? Don't pretend we all don't know what is more likely at this point, based on everything that we just discussed in this whole episode. Is it more likely that we follow America's best interests or Israel's best interests? I don't even think I have to answer that for you. The last clip we'll watch here is Netanyahu discussing how he wants to get rid of U.S. aid to Israel over a 10-year timeline. Now, this is obviously just slipped in here by Netanyahu to try and create some favorability for the American public and try and win back some PR points because of how disastrous he is viewed here in the United States. So they are trying to say, look, Netanyahu, he wants to decouple from the United States in a 10-year timeline. He wants to cut off all financial aid from the United States to Israel over a 10-year timeline. No, he's doing this because they have sucked us dry with everything they've ever wanted for the last 30 plus years. They actually don't need U.S. aid. If the regime in Iran is overthrown, then Israel could go without the $3.8 billion a year that we send them, because then they will have achieved the power that they've been wanting to accumulate over the past 30 years. So this is viewed as some gracious gesture from Netanyahu, but that obviously just ignores the fact that if they had it their way in 10 years, then they would not need the $3.8 billion from the United States at all. And they don't even, just the $3.8 billion, by the way, that's not even a significant chunk of what we give them. We give them tens of billions of dollars a year in extra spending that will even go, that either the U.S. Congress votes for or that Marco Rubio will just unilaterally send to them over the top of Congress, which he did last year. He sent them, I think it was $25 billion last year. It went straight through Congress and gave them emergency funding. So this idea that the $3.8 billion is this crazy significant number of the aid that we give to Israel, yeah, it's a number. It's over decades and years, it does accumulate into quite the sum of money. But what's also very significant is the amount of aid that we give them unilaterally just over the course of a year in weapons packages and financial packages. That's where the majority of the aid to Israel is. And Netanyahu saying we can go without the $3.8 billion from the United States per year. Okay, what about the other $30 billion that we give you a year in weapons and aid besides that? So here's Netanyahu. Take a look.
Do you believe it's time for the state of Israel to re-examine and possibly reset its financial relationship to the United States, meaning what the United States provides to Israel on an annual basis?
Absolutely. And I've said this to President Trump. I've said it to our own people. Their jaws dropped. But I said, look.
Well, what do you mean? What are you saying?
I want to draw down to zero the American financial support, the financial component of the military cooperation that we have, because we receive $3.8 billion a year. And I think that it's time that we weaned ourselves from the remaining military support.
Can you give me a timetable?
I said, let's start now and do it over the next decade, over the next 10 years, but I want to start now. I don't want to wait for the next Congress. I want to start now. It could go down very fast.
So obviously, again, that is just slipped in there for PR purposes because he has to throw a bone to the people who have been complaining about the aid that we give to Israel, because he has to try and win some favor back with this crowd that's very much against giving any aid to Israel. But that is where we will end it off for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Again, please be sure to go down below and hit like and subscribe here on YouTube. And also go to my Instagram, X, Spotify, and Substack and give all of those a follow. And also, once again, please be sure to go to antiwar.com and read my 2 latest articles over there. I'd really appreciate it. I worked hard on those, and I'm proud that they got published on antiwar.com. So again, please be sure to go to read those on antiwar.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Have a good one.
It is about who we are. It is about what we believe.
They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
The more you tell the truth, the stronger you become.
Mr. Speaker, we're not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic tonight. We're putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg.